This is a graph showing a massive sign of the dire state of Canada's pathetic economy. And it actually has nothing to do with any of Canada's hot-button issues, like Canada's insane housing prices, the affordability crisis, or Toronto Maple Leafs fans not having their hopes and dreams crushed once again. You see, this is the net amount of investment between Canada and the USA every single year in the amount of billions of dollars. From 2001 up until 2014, Canada took in tens of billions of more foreign investment from the United States than vice versa, meaning that businesses, large and small, from Walmart to your local carpenter, were much more likely to move to Canada and grow the economy than it was for a business to leave Canada for the United States. However, this changed in 2015, and coincidentally or not, lined up with the current Liberal government getting into power. Regardless, quickly over the next decade, Canadian businesses, investors, entrepreneurs, and professionals started taking their money out of Canada and moving it to the United States. And well, where is that number now? Well, I am hoping that you are sitting down because this number was so shocking that it inspired me to make this video. By 2022, $1 trillion in book value had left Canada for the United States, and a net value of $460 billion left for the United States. That is $11,500 per person in Canada in net investment leaving Canada for the US. And that number for 2023 or even this year is potentially going to reach $500 billion in net outflow of investments from Canada to the US. That's about $12,500 per person. Keep in mind, that represents potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even 1 million jobs for Canadians, while it could also mean potentially much higher wages, higher innovation, research, building of machines, contracts, opportunities for businesses, and much more. So despite this being a dot on a graph, this is technically about $500 billion leaving Canada. But you know what? That might actually be enough money to help bribe Satan to lift the curse off of the Toronto Maple Leafs. A number that I once thought was impossible. But the real question is, why is this money leaving Canada? Specifically, why is so much investment leaving Canada for the US, and why aren't American businesses investing as much into Canada? Well, once again, this is the sign of a dying and pathetic economy. Let's start off with one reason why no one wants to invest in Canada. There is something called the OECD's FDI Regulatory Restrictive Index. And yes, that is a mouthful, but just to explain what it is, it pretty much puts a number on how easy it is for a foreign entity to invest in a country. The easiest country to invest in is Germany. Japan is somewhat middle of the pack. The United States is actually double most of the other nations on this list. And then there's Canada, essentially tripling the difficulty to invest in the country compared to the average. And this is because of a litany of laws, regulations, taxes, and more. And the irony is, it is extremely difficult to invest in Canada at the moment, yet it is extremely easy to move to Canada, as Canada currently has the highest immigration rate in the history of the Western world, which is also a sign of a dying economy, but we will get to that in a bit. You see, Canada is a part of this globalized economy, and whether you like it or not, a globalized economy allows for big businesses to see the entire world as their playing field. They are not just locked in to their home country. So, when Canada has the highest total corporate tax in the world and plans to keep raising it, the corporate overlords of Canada have no allegiance to stay and lose out on billions of dollars in profit. Why would they do that when they can legally just park it in another country and save that money? And even the ones that keep their money within Canada, they tend to not do anything with it. You see, the big banks in Canada and the largest corporations have the equivalent of 1/3 of the entire country's GDP sitting in bank accounts, doing absolutely nothing. Not investing in the country, not researching anything, not creating jobs, just sitting. You know, I always joke about how some large corporations in Canada are kind of like Smaug from The Hobbit. Essentially, they're like a giant dragon that hoards all of the gold and the treasure, and there's nothing that a normal person can really do about it because, well, Smaug is just so powerful. And that's kind of what Canadian corporations are like. They are like, well, smog. In fact, one of the craziest stats about Canada is that it is the world leader in one other thing. You see, it leads the Western world in the lack of capital investments per employee, meaning that no other country has businesses that hoard their profits better than they do in Canada. Just some perspective, Canada does this at a rate of about double that of the United States, a country that is well known for its corporate overlords hoarding their profits. Many business leaders cite high taxes, fees, and long approval processes as reasons that they don't do anything substantial with this money. And there is some truth to that. In the real estate sector in a city like Vancouver, it costs $125,000 in government fees alone to get the approval to build a one-bedroom condo. Now also, Canada is one of the slowest countries in the world in terms of trade. Out of 113 tracked countries that have their speed of trade time measured, Canada ranks 103rd. In fact, one of Canada's fastest ports is the Port of Vancouver. That has a turnaround time of about 2 days, which is twice as slow as some of the comparable ports like the Port of Melbourne and the Port of Long Beach. And it's not even in the same ballpark as the world leaders in trade and ports, like the Port of Busan, which has a turnaround time of about half a day. So why does it take so long to import or export anything in Canada? Well, the largest reason is because of something we already talked about, lack of capital investment into these ports. You see, a lot of these ports are running on the same tech from half a century ago and have not been updated. Meanwhile, the world leaders' ports look like they were created from a sci-fi movie that Canadians could only dream about. Canadian ports are also notorious for going on strike, sometimes even multiple times a year. And Canada has a long list of regulatory checkpoints for anything that goes into or leaves the country, meaning that the country has a lot more bureaucracy surrounding goods compared to most other countries. Now, all of these things mentioned so far make it seem like monopoly money is a better investment than the Canadian dollar. But we've only just briefly touched on the core issues. Because one of the arguably biggest results from all of these things mentioned so far is a lack of productivity in the Canadian economy. Meaning, how much do Canadians make stuff? Back in the 1970s, Canada was the 6th most productive economy in the world. And now, Canada has fallen to 18th, the steepest decline in the world during that time. In fact, Canada's productivity is 30% lower than the poorest United states like Alabama, and is losing ground to Alabama. A big reason as to why Canadians are making less stuff is because of the previous things mentioned as well. Canadians make things, the money comes in, and corporations choose to not reinvest that money into Canada, once again hoarding it like smog. So, we have Canada's economic situation looking pretty bad right now. So bad that they are viewed as having the worst economic future of any advanced economy in the world for the next 3 decades. And the people that are paying the price for this are the middle class and young people. You see, once upon a time, just 2 decades ago, you could go to school, get a decent paying job with having only a few people to compete against. If you got that job, you would have some job stability, you could raise a family, and buy a house without needing to sell your kidney for a down payment. This led to many Canadians owning homes, having low debt, and being able to enjoy life in one of the most prosperous economies in the world. But just 2 decades later, oh how things have changed. The government of Canada decided to bring in 10 times more immigrants per capita than the United States. And most of this immigration is men between the ages of 18 and 40. Essentially, this has been catapulting Canada's population into unforeseen growth in hopes of keeping Canada's GDP numbers up and to hopefully help fix a lack of labor in the job market. But, well, that's what they tell the public. In reality, Canada did not have a shortage of workers. There was a shortage in people willing to work for minimum wage jobs at a time when the lack of affordability to live was skyrocketing. You used to be able to rent out a studio apartment in most cities for simply having a low wage yet full-time job in Canada. Yet now, you may not even be able to afford to split a condo with roommates for that wage. So now there's an influx of workers to suppress wages and to fill the lowest paying jobs, which has led to one of the craziest economic experiments in history. So one thing that has happened because of this influx is there is now a major gender imbalance in Canada. There are now 10% more men than women between the ages of 18 and 40, which in a monogamous society could lead to some sort of issues down the road, to say the very least. The second of which is, despite having the biggest population explosion in history, nothing else has kept pace. By that I mean housing builds are down, infrastructure investment is down, there are the same amount of hospitals, police stations, fire stations, and so on. So there are now millions of more people in Canada, and yet infrastructure and supply of things like housing has not improved. And that leads us to this graph. This is the income to house price ratio of Canada. For most of Canada's history, this number was at or under 3, meaning that if someone earned $50,000 a year, the average house price would be about $150,000. There were a few times when this number touched as high as 5 in the late 80s and early 1990s, meaning that someone who earned $50,000 a year could expect to see house prices at around $250,000. But then 2015 happened, and for the first time in history, this number far exceeded 5. And this was an important year because the typical mortgage rules say that you can only get a mortgage on a house that is at maximum 5 times your annual income. So when the average income to price ratio exceeds 5, that means that the average Canadian can no longer afford an average house. And that's what happened in 2015, and it only kept getting worse. In 2020, that number hit around 7, and this year, that number is nearing 10. Meaning that the average Canadian couldn't even afford half of a mortgage on an average house in Canada. And when you consider that the number one path to wealth in Canada has been real estate, young people are now being locked out of the only way that the previous 3 generations have generated wealth. In fact, real estate has become so important in Canada that it is now the number one sector of Canada's entire economy. And the Canadian government has said repeatedly that it does not want real estate prices to come down, because if prices come down, the entire economy might collapse. So this is where we are. Another sign of a truly dying economy. The only thing that is keeping Canada's economy from collapsing is literally buying and selling houses. Think about how crazy that statement is. This has caused Canada's youth to become so pessimistic that only 27% see their personal financial situation improving in the near future, and only 1/3 foresee Canada as a country that will prosper again anytime soon. So, an important question arises. Can Canada ever dig itself out of this mess? And if so, how? Well, can it? That answer is yes. Will it? That answer is probably not. You see, there's a few things that need to happen in order for Canada to help bring prosperity back to the middle class. One of which will almost certainly not happen is reducing immigration numbers, which is also quite an interesting topic, because not too long ago, the left-wing parties in the Canadian government were very anti-immigration. You see, they viewed immigration as a gift to corporations for bringing in low-skilled workers and suppressing wages. Yet, the left-wing parties today view it as a positive and stick on a stamp of diversity is our strength, which is quite a 180 compared to just a few decades ago. However, from what I've been able to find, not one of the single 3 major parties in Canada expect to reduce immigration anytime soon. In fact, the current government plans to keep ramping it up. So, expect Canada's population to keep ballooning along with the cost of living. Another important thing that comes from an RBC report is that they said if Canada could begin reopening its natural resources for investment and get rid of the highest regulatory and tax burden in the world, that could provide an actual boom to the Canadian economy. They cite government restrictions on oil and natural resources as a key factor as to the lack of investment in Canada. Another thing that could potentially help is, well, just switching governments. The current Liberal Party of Canada is the most unpopular party in the modern history of Canada. And a good example as to why this is, well, this anecdote. When the price of housing was climbing in 2015, they had no housing plan. When housing prices exploded in 2020, they had no housing plan. In 2023, they decided to start caring about housing again in Canada by having the government go on a paid housing retreat for a weekend, all expenses paid, and guess what? They came back with no housing plan. It wasn't until about a month and a half ago, after having a housing crisis for essentially 8 years, that the Canadian government finally put together an actual plan for the thing that Canadians care about the most, which is housing. They waited until Canadians reached a point of bankruptcy and becoming the most indebted people in the world to actually start caring about this issue. And keep in mind, this is also despite having their other policies like immigration, their money printing, taking out more debt, and so on, directly increasing the cost and price of housing. Regardless, Canada's economy is pathetic and dying right now. It is entirely based on real estate, and its current economic future is bleak. Young people are struggling, productivity is falling off a cliff, and companies are leaving Canada at a record pace. Will it correct its course anytime soon? It seems unlikely. But it is possible. And if that were to happen, we would experience one of the very few modern economic miracles in history. And if you liked this video, make sure to click on my documentaries playlist and hit that subscribe button, as over 90% of you that watch my videos are still not subscribers. But anyways, for now, make sure to click on my next video, and I will see you guys in my next video in just a few seconds.